Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we're back with another Fabula Ultima video. This time talking about the core of many builds out there, the Darkblade, or the Dark Knight, or whatever. You know, this is Fabula Ultima. All the classes are more or less just a vague archetype of a certain type of character. And I gotta say, though, the Darkblade itself is a insanely good class that works in so many different builds and offers so much that you're going to want to keep in mind. And for any time you make any build, what the Darkblade has to offer, because there's likely a chance it's definitely going to be able to add to your build more than anything. But before we get into that, you may have noticed my new shirt here, unless you've watched some of my other videos. But I do got to mention this. I have been sponsored by Into the AM. They want me to tell you guys about these shirts and the crazy good deal. Obviously, this one has like blue on it that for some reason my green screen thinks it's green, so 1 second. So you can see here the Viking shirt. It's pretty good. I'm all about the Aesir, the Asgard, all that kind of stuff. I love Vikings. I am Scandinavian myself. So this shirt is really good, and honestly, the bundle deal they have on the site is even better. You can get 3 shirts for under 60 bucks, which is a pretty good deal considering most graphic tees sell for, $25. And if you use my code linked in the description, you get the 10% off of their 3 shirt deal that normally is about 61 bucks, but with the 10% off, obviously that's going to be $6 off, making it somewhere in the realm of $55, which I think is a really good deal. So if you want to get some really nice graphic tees or normal tees or whatever other clothing brands they have on the site, use my link in the description to get at least 10% off. But anyway, let's go ahead and get on to the video. So, Darkblade. This is a class that's all about being edgy, hating your enemies more than anything, and above all else, hurting yourself for more power. If you want to play Virgil, this is probably a good class to start with. So, what do you get as a Darkblade? Well, the initial free benefits are actually really good. Not only do you get 5 extra HP, which is very solid and you're absolutely going to need for the Darkblade, but you also gain the ability to equip martial melee weapons and martial armor. Now, this is the first time that we've seen this in this series that I've done so far, so to briefly explain, melee weapons are essentially melee weapons that are better than the basics, typically. They hit harder, they can do more things. So this just gives your character more options for better weapons. Martial armor, same kind of deal. It's typically better armor that gives you better benefits or can work for your build better than the basic armors typically do. So that being the case, really good benefits. Obviously, if you want to have any kind of martial ability in your class, Darkblade is definitely going to be the way to go. And honestly, a lot of like Gish melee caster kind of builds, if you want to play a sword sage or anything like that, typically dip into Darkblade for some of its benefits like agony, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but also for the martial melee weapons and the weapon and the armor as well. So, very strong, just free benefits that we have with the Darkblade. But let's go ahead and talk about the skills. So starting off with agony, this one is kind of the core of a lot of people's concept around Darkblade and why it's so appealing to so many people. Agony itself, if you deal damage in this, and I was mistaken in my Chimeras video, I'm still getting used to the game and I missed a word. I have dyslexia, so it happens. With Chimeras, you did need to hit an enemy with a spell using a certain kind of weapon in order to get the extra mind points back. With Agony, you just need to have a bond, and then it doesn't matter what type of damage you do, whether it's spell damage or with any kind of melee weapon. There's not many real restrictions other than the fact that you need a bond. And this is the first class that we're talking about that revolves around bonds, which I'll explain in a moment. But more or less what happens is every time you hit a creature that you have a bond with, you gain your skill level ×2 in hit points and mind points. And since you can have 5 skill levels indicated by the star with a 5 here on the skill, that means at max you can get 10 mind points and 10 hit points every time you damage a creature you have a bond with. So what's a bond? A bond is a special feature in Fabula Ultima, typically mostly done with either your arch nemesis or your closest of friends or family. Though the Darkblade does have ways of getting bonds easily in combat, which we're going to look at here in a moment. But it is something that if you use a Fabula point, you can actually add your bond value to a check. So a Darkblade is actually insanely good against the arc enemy of a lot of campaigns, because typically whatever their bonds are, whatever their bond strength is, which you can have a max bond strength of 3, means that you can, at any time when attacking that target, spend a Fabula point to add to your ability to hit that target. Now, most people can, but Darkblades get extra benefits for doing so. Like with Agony here, that gives you a bunch of hit points and mind points, giving you an insane amount of sustain as long as you're dealing with an enemy you have a bond with. So that kind of leaves us at this kind of rough point of bonds are really hard to just make out of nowhere. You either need to get an opportunity, typically through getting a critical strike in combat, where you can use bonding. This allows you to make a bond towards someone or something in a scene, either giving yourself a bond or adding one to your existing bonds for a scene, or you need to use one of the Darkblade's other skills. Mostly Heart of Darkness. Yeah, very edgy indeed, but Heart of Darkness is really strong because it adds so much to other parts of the Darkblade's kit. Predominantly, the ability to add a bond. So once per scene, when you enter Crisis, Crisis being half your HP or less, you can make a bond towards a specific creature. If you do, you create a bond of hatred towards that creature. Now, obviously, anytime you crit, you can also create bonds, which is very helpful. And you can only ever, at max, have 6 bonds at any one time, which is very interesting for a Darkblade, because if you're playing a Darkblade who's really going into Agony, Heart of Darkness, all that kind of stuff, you need to keep some bond slots open to make the most use of your class, which means your character can't get as close to some NPCs or player characters in your game, which is, it makes a lot of sense. I love this mechanic because it blends with the role play so well. You keep your heart kind of sectioned off. You need to place for your hatred. And this is where Heart of Darkness comes in, and the ability to make bonds through opportunities as well. So you use Heart of Darkness once you hit Crisis once per scene. So obviously, if the boss or champion or whatever strong enemy is still up, you do this. That enemy is marked now every time you're hitting them. You're likely, anyway, if you invested in Agony, getting hit points and mind points back every time you do, which allows you to have way more sustain, which is going to be important for another feature we're about to talk about, but also allows us to get some mind points back. So if we're using any other class features that use mind points, which, by the way, Darkblade actually doesn't have any features that uses mind points. So this is purely for the sake of the multi-classing in the game, which is insanely cool. It gives Darkblade so much synergy. So before we talk about some of the other really cool features, I will say also, when you go into Crisis, if you have Heart of Darkness, and you can also pick up Dark Blood, which will give you resistance to any dark damage and poison damage. Now, Dark Blood is very situational, but a lot of strong enemies in the game tend to lean towards darkness, as kind of the case with a lot of these kind of games. So it does have some good use, and poison damage is always really terrible, though you still can become poisoned, which is an important thing to mention. So Dark Blood is something that if you plan on going into Crisis a lot, you might as well pick up a full-on resistance to 2 types of damages. But let's talk about Shadow Strike. This is where we really need that sustain from Agony to really make the most use out of Darkblade. So with Shadow Strike specifically, you may choose to make a Shadow Strike as an action. Shadow Strike is its own unique action, and when you do so, you roll your current might die. So if you have any penalties to your might die, that will change the size of the die, obviously. But when you roll your might die, and then you lose a number of hit points equal to the number rolled on that might die. So Starting out, you can have a D10, but you might also just lose 10 HP, which is a little scary, at least early game. If this doesn't kill you, which is real, well, doesn't set you to 0 hit points, doesn't necessarily kill you, but you know, it's a gamble if you're at very low HP. So make sure you do this when you're over your might die in health at the very least. But if this doesn't set you to 0, then you may perform a free attack. What free attack means in this situation is it's usually free attacks are a part of another action. This is a Shadow Strike action, which is not an attack. Shadow Strike is its own unique action. So Shadow Strike leads to a free attack. Hopefully that made sense. I will do a video on how to play Fabula Ultima in the very near future once my schedule kind of balances out a bit. But anyway, free attack on the creature. If that attack hits one or more targets, it deals an extra amount of damage equal to your skill level plus the number rolled on your might die. However, all the damage dealt by this attack becomes dark, and its damage type cannot be changed. So you have to use this carefully. Obviously, if the enemy has resistance or immunity to dark, not a good idea. But skill level plus the might die roll, I mean, let's just take a look at this. If you're playing a martial character, you're likely have a D10. So you're likely to have a 5 or 6, 5.5 technically the average, a 6 as your average roll. Plus skill level with a max skill rank of 5 in this particular one, meaning you can deal 11 extra damage on average with maxed out Shadow Strike. That's insanely cool. I absolutely love this one, and it does play into the make it or break it kind of situation when it comes to the Darkblade, where you're pushing yourself to the edge to push your enemy over the edge faster. It's really cool. I really like the Darkblade. I like how a lot of its features are very synergistic with itself, but more importantly with other types of classes. Other martial characters are going to appreciate the sustain with Agony and Heart of Darkness allowing you to use Agony, and Shadow Strike allowing you to pump the extra damage, especially if the enemy is getting to their last few dregs of life. So Shadow Strike is not something I would use a ton unless you got a lot of healing in your party, which you might do. But I would definitely use it as a finisher to make sure that you, again, push the enemy over the edge before you take yourself over it yourself. Now, they do have one more skill, and that's Painful Lesson. And I actually really, really like this one because it has really interesting synergy with another class called the Lore Master, which we'll talk about later. But this one is great. So, Painful Lesson. You can take this skill up to 3 times, and anytime a creature causes you to lose hit points, now this is usually from an attack or spell, but it can be any method. So, anything they do to make you lose hit points, you can immediately perform the study action on that creature. Now, the study action is essentially, if you're familiar with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, this is a recall knowledge check, but more or less, you learn some features about a creature that is dealing damage to you. So you might learn what attacks it might be able to do, what its resistances are, or what its vulnerabilities are, or what some of its traits are, which is important for some of the other classes. Now, when you make this study action, you need to typically roll insight. So it might not be very good if you're going full martial, but if you do it this way, you get a bonus to your equal to your skill level, which is max 3 to the check, which means honestly, you'll still be doing pretty well. Even if your insight isn't particularly that good, you're still going to be doing better than even smarter characters on average if you put enough points into Painful Lesson. So yeah, you just get hit and you get a free action. Typically, in order to study, you have to use that as your action on your turn. So this gives you extra action economy, essentially, by just letting you roll anytime you're hit. And you can do this any number of times, though it does mention here, remember, you can only study the same aspect of a creature only once. So if you want to know its vulnerabilities, you can only do it once. So if it doesn't work, you have to roll on something else. But Painful Lesson really stacks on top of the fact that Darkblade, just being Darkblade, even if Darkblade isn't your main class, is going to give you extra action economy and benefits. Like, a smart character is going to want to take Painful Lesson just because anytime they're hit, they just get a bonus use of study, which is insanely good. So the Darkblade is a fascinating class. They have all kinds of interesting features that allow them to get hurt and to deal the hurt back, and their heroic skills are no different. So, starting off with adversity here in the core book, what adversity does is anytime you're suffering from one or more status effects, you gain a +1 bonus to all checks for every status effect you're currently suffering from. And in addition to this, you deal 2 extra damage for every status effect you are suffering from. So, that being the case, and this is any extra damage for any source. So this can be applied to your spells, arcana, items you throw, everything, which gives this insane diversity and use with other classes, making Darkblade, again, one of the best classes to mix into. But you know what's even more insane about adversity? And oh yeah, so this is the first time we talked about status conditions in the game. What do they do? Typically, status conditions in Fabula Ultima will reduce the die size of a particular skill or skills depending on the condition. So, for instance, days typically will reduce your character's insight, going from whatever, like a D8 to a D6. So, under adversity, days actually makes you a D6 +1, which is almost better than a D8 kind of. So again, how statistics work is a D6 average roll is 3.5. That means on average you're going to roll a 3 or a 4, and a D8 is 4.5. So you're going to roll either a 4 or a 5. So likely you are to get the same as if you were rolling a D8, with the slight probability that the D8 might roll 1 potentially better. But that's not all, because adversity is a net gain after 2 conditions. So if you are suffering from 2 conditions, your value, the die value reductions even out, essentially, being +2. So a D8 going down to a D6 doesn't really matter because you're adding +2 to the D6 roll, meaning that your max is the same and your minimum is actually way better, which is kind of insane. And in addition to that, with 2 conditions, you're also dealing 4 extra damage. Adversity is insanely good, but I will say that unless you're somehow afflicting yourself with these conditions, which is possible, you have to rely on the enemies to do it for you. So there are some very wonky kind of ways that you can somehow target yourself with some spells or certain abilities to give yourself bonuses with adversity. So I really, really, really like adversity. I really love it for Darkblade, and it really enhances that. The more you suffer, the stronger you get. So, suffering 2 status conditions is just a net gain, and it completely removes any fear of status conditions in the game. So, an insanely good pickup. And this is just the first heroic skill we're talking about today. The other core book heroic skill we're going to talk about is Heartbreaker. This one is also a Darkblade exclusive, and it allows you to, whenever you hit a creature with an attack, and that attack only targets a creature that you have a bond with, so, with Heart of Darkness or maybe through one of your opportunities, then you may choose to spend half your current hit points rounded down. Now, if you do this, the attack deals extra damage equals to 10 times the strength of your bond towards that target. Now, typically that's going to be ×1. You're not likely to have more than one unless you do a few crits in a fight. So you're going to spend half your hit points to do 10 extra damage more often than not. But this can be up to 30 extra damage. Now, you can only apply a Heartbreaker on a skill that is being used during your turn, and you can only do this once per turn. Regardless, that's an insanely powerful benefit. Now, I will say, starting out, you're likely to have between 45 and 55 HP. So if you're doing this at max HP, you're going to be spending over 20 HP to do more than likely 10. So you have to be careful when using this one, but it's only half of your current HP. So the lower your health gets, the more efficient Heartbreaker is because the less damage it's doing to yourself. Granted, it is edging you ever closer to just, dropping dead in the middle of a fight. So you have to use this one very carefully. But I will state, because if you're using Agony in addition to the use with Heartbreaker, when you hit the target, you're going to gain up to 10 HP back. So that will factor into when you want to use this, because if you're, say, at like 20 HP and you hit your target, that'll bump you up to 30 HP, maybe, which cutting that in half will leave you at 15, meaning you only really lost 5 life than what you started that attack with, which is honestly not a bad way to add an extra 10 damage to the target. And there is no restriction on number of bond strengths you can have. You can only have 6 bonds, but each of those bonds could be 3 strength bonds maxed out. So if this is against the main villain of a campaign, you may have maxed out your bonds against that villain at this point, in which case this is going to drop an additional 30 damage when you strike that target alone, as long as you got the hit points to spend. Heartbreaker is definitely one of the heroic skills I feel like you need to be much more careful when selecting, but the damage potential is insane, and especially because it applies this damage to any attack, this is powerful. So it has to be an attack. This could be a free attack, though, so it could be done with Shadow Strike, depending, but it has to be an attack of some kind. I think this Heartbreaker is insanely powerful, and it's really, really good as long as you can manage your HP, which, there are some ways that you can really make sure that your character doesn't die, or if your team is backing you up, you can just pump out the damage, and your team could be healing you or doing whatever. So Heartbreaker, even better when you have some good friends to back you up, which is perfect for story. Now, while there are other heroic skills that Darkblade does have access to, most of those are kind of general for martial characters, so I won't mention them here. But I will talk about a couple that showed up in the techno fantasy book that came out for Fabula Ultima recently. And the first one we're going to talk about is actually Dream Slice. So Dream Slice is a combo of Darkblade and Esper. You need either one of these maxed out to get this one. But honestly, this one definitely leans a lot more into Darkblade. So whenever you hit one or more creatures with an attack from your Shadow Strike skill specifically, using a weapon that belongs to the sword category, each of those creatures lose an amount of mind points equal to the number you rolled on your might die for Shadow Strike. Then, if the number you rolled on your might die was 8 or higher, so you lost a lot of points but did a lot of damage and now do a lot of mind point damage, you may choose one creature hit by the attack. If that creature is your focus, or you have a bond towards them, that creature will perform one fewer actions during their next turn. Dream Slice is a DM's worst nightmare. If you get a Shadow Strike and you roll an 8 or higher on your might die, this can even make the big bad lose one of their actions on a turn. Now, I will state that champion enemies, and typically most bosses are a champion of some form, get multiple actions. So this isn't going to be like a stun lock where you stun the boss over and over and over again. But on weaker enemies, this will just neutralize them completely. They won't be able to do anything. And even against the big bad, one less action is probably going to mean a lot for your team. So Dream Slice is insanely good. And the fact that it also pairs well with Esper, which does have some really good synergies with Darkblade, which we'll talk about in a much later video, does actually give it even better benefits. Now, obviously, Dream Slice is predominantly meant for Darkblade because you need Shadow Strike to use this. But you don't have to have it mastered. You only need to master Esper if that's the way you want to go. So something to keep in mind. Also, again, having a bond towards them really helps out. And if you don't have a bond, which is very likely in most situations, this does allow you to get something as long as that creature is your focus, which is something we'll talk about in the Esper, which does mean that the Darkblade can get extra benefits towards some enemies with this particular heroic skill. So I will say Dream Slice is really good, very synergistic, and as well will make your character a nightmare for your DM, which I'm sure many of you will love. And the final heroic skill we're actually going to be talking about today is going to be Make It or Break It. Now, funny enough, even though this is in the Techno Fantasy book, this one is specifically for Darkblade and or Fury characters, which Fury is actually the next class we'll be talking about, so stay tuned for that. But this one is very interesting, and it also really plays into the kill the enemy no matter what, no matter the sacrifice that Darkblade tends to have. So whenever you attack an enemy with a weapon, you may declare it to be a Make It or Break It before the accuracy check. If you do, the check's high roll is doubled, which is insane. That means whatever you roll on the higher of your two dice, typically might be might, could be might dex, might be something else depending on how your build is, gets doubled, which means potentially could be 24 damage if you max roll on a d12. So that's insane, because the high roll always adds to the damage of most melee weapons. So anyway, if you do, the high roll is damage, and if the result of the check is even, then that weapon becomes no longer usable. So you have a 50-50% chance of your weapon no longer being usable. Now, it talks about transforming weapons here, which is not something that I'm going to talk about in this video. That'll be for a later video. But mostly what it's talking about is whatever weapon you're using just cannot be used. You have to place it in your backpack, and it can't be used for the rest of the scene. It doesn't mean your weapon is gone forever, though, which is important to mention. It just means for the rest of that scene, you can't use that weapon anymore. Though, even if you have to put your weapon in your backpack, you can use the equipment action as a free action, which means as long as you have a spare weapon on hand, which obviously if you're using Make It or Break It, you should, you won't be without a weapon. Now, this doesn't work on things like unarmed strikes, improvised weapons, or weapon modules, which is another thing that's mostly from Techno Fantasy, or twin shields, which is another unique type of weapon. So there are some restrictions, but honestly, it's not that bad. And these restrictions are predominantly just so that you don't abuse the system. Be like, all right, I strike them with the leg of a chair, do a lot of damage because I'm doubling my high roll, and I'm just going to break another leg off a chair and do that. It's kind of trying to avoid that cheese, and there's supposed to be some cost to this ability. So you don't want to use this with your better weapon, but if you want to get a cheeky, like really good damage off towards the beginning of a fight, Make It or Break It with like one of your lesser weapons is really not a bad choice. And the fact that this stacks with Fury, which is one of the other most common martial multi-classes that you pick up, this does have a lot of good synergy, again, with Darkblade and Fury. So overall, if we talk about everything we learned about Darkblade here today, we have a class that is insanely powerful, really good at killing bosses, gives you really good benefits, and more than anything, gives you a little bit of dark edge you can justify in your character, which is a lot of fun. Narratively, this class is strong. Mechanically, this class is strong. And more than anything, it can pair up with so many other classes, having some really good synergy. So overall, you really want to consider Darkblade for every class you look into whenever you're making a new character, because there's likely something it can offer. I'm not going to say it's going to be good for every kind of build, but it's definitely good for a lot of builds. Most builds I've seen have a little bit of Darkblade in them, at least at some point. So overall, another really good class. Fabula Ultima has so many bangers, and the best part about it is you can mix and match as you see fit. You can take the parts from Darkblade you want and add it to whatever your character idea is. Darkblade does not have to define your character, but it can definitely enhance it, which I think is, again, Fabula Ultima's strength. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. And if you liked this video and you want to see more Fabula Ultima content out there, please like the video. This helps make it much easier to be seen on the algorithm, because, you know, Fabula Ultima does not do really well on the algorithm. And as well, if you want to see my content specifically on it, go ahead and subscribe so you can see everything I'm going to talk about. I'm going to cover all the classes and everything else that comes out for Fabula Ultima as time goes on. So that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.